Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We will get started in just a moment. Okay, well, thank you so much again for joining us for this webinar today regarding the housing and homelessness elements of Governor Gavin Newsom's 2023-2024 proposed budget plan. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, my name is Victoria Gonzalez-Gerlach, and I'm the Deputy Secretary for External Affairs here at the California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. We will be taking questions at the end of our remarks. Please write your question in the question and answer box located on your screen if you would like to pose a question to our team. Please note that this call is being recorded and closed captioning is available on this call. In a moment, we will include the instructions for that in the chat, but know that in order to access, you can click the show captions button. Subtitles will be clicked and dragged and moved to their position in the meeting window. And although English is the default language, there are other languages available if you select them. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing everyone who is speaking on today's call. We have Lourdes Castro Ramirez, who is the Secretary of the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. Sasha Kurgan, our Deputy Secretary of Housing and Consumer Relations here at BCSH. Dakshika Wickrama, our Deputy Secretary for Homelessness at BCSH. And Corinne Buchanan, who is the Deputy Secretary of Policy and Strategic Planning at the California Health and Human Services Agency. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Secretary Castro Ramirez, who will get things started.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I know that as you all know, our state is being pounded by storms up and down. And so I hope that you're all staying safe. And so let's go ahead and get started. I do want to acknowledge a few members of our team who have joined us, members from the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, starting with Undersecretary Melinda Grant, Deputy Secretary of Fiscal Policy and Administration, Tiffany Garcia, Deputy Secretary for Equity and Strategic Initiatives, Erica Gonzalez, Assistant Secretary of Legislation, Miles White, and Senior Advisor, Annie Carney. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the Director of Finance, Joe Steffenshaw, and members of his team who have joined us today for this call to also assist with any questions that you all may have. From the Department of Finance, we're joined by Teresa Calvert, Chris Cook, Andrew March, and Chris Hill. One last member of my team that has joined us today, Deputy Secretary for Legislation, Amy Wilson. Thank you for being with us. As I mentioned before I begin, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize that there's a severe storm underway affecting so many people across our state, including, as we know, individuals that are unsheltered and housing insecure. As we speak, the governor has been visiting a number of storm-impacted areas, specifically in the Santa Cruz County, and coordinating with local officials on the state's response and recovery efforts. We will continue to do our best to respond to this urgency in this urgent moment with care, with compassion, and we encourage all of you to continue heeding the advice and the warnings and the instructions from your local emergency centers. So please stay safe. You all know this morning, the governor had an opportunity to present his budget. The governor's $297 billion budget invests in the people of California and reflects the administration's priorities and our values. Governor Newsom and this legislature have been working to implement a number of programs that are so needed by Californians across our state, from universal transitional kindergarten for all four-year-olds to expanding childcare, making healthcare affordable and accessible to all, regardless of immigration status, and also enabling more people to graduate from college without crippling debt. The state has also made historic investments to protect Californians against the impact of climate change. We at our agency have been very involved and engaged working with members of the governor's cabinet to ensure that our investments are coordinated in such a way that we are building healthy, resilient, climate-friendly communities. These unprecedented investments over the past 4 years to build resiliency and resilience are continuing to improve both the quality of life and the long-term outlook for all Californians. And we're not slowing down. We're not standing down. As you heard from the governor, we are very committed to continuing the momentum and continuing the focus on protecting and creating greater opportunity for all Californians. The governor also, of course, mentioned this morning that the revenue outlook is substantially different from what we have seen in the last 2 years. But California has planned for this. We have built up reserves and resiliency through prudent strategic planning, through being thoughtful and being prepared for a potential economic downturn. Through strong fiscal planning, the governor's budget will protect core programs and continue building a California for today and into the future. So let's turn over to housing and homelessness. I think you all know this very well because you're doing, many of you that have joined us today are doing the work in your community in terms of creating more housing that's affordable, housing that's supported, housing that is integrated into the fabric of communities. In the last 4 years, California has invested more to increase the housing supply. Along with these investments, the state, through our agency and through the strong leadership of HCD, CalHFA, and several other departments, we've deployed a comprehensive set of strategies to facilitate housing production and housing preservation. These efforts range from furthering administrative efficiencies and providing technical assistance to our local partners. We also have been working very closely to improve the state financing system and programs, targeting housing dollars, providing technical assistance to rural, tribal, and urban areas, leveraging land use tools, and holding local governments accountable. We remain committed to working with the legislature on ways to remove and to continue to remove state and local barriers to the development of housing. And we remain committed to enforcing state housing laws and to holding jurisdictions accountable for planning and meeting their housing obligations. Of course, given the clear connection between housing affordability and homelessness, the state's housing efforts cannot be different. They cannot be distinct from the strategies that we're using to prevent and end homelessness. In the last 2 years, Governor Newsom has invested $15.3 billion to address homelessness, more than ever before in state history. I think he mentioned this morning that when he stepped in almost 4 years ago, the total amount of funding that was being allocated for homelessness was about $500 million. So we've come a very long way. I will say that the budget maintains billions of this commitment and this commitment to investing billions of dollars to provide aid to local governments, and there are no proposed cuts to the homelessness budget. Of course, the last few years, we also have been working more closely to ensure that there is greater alignment in terms of the homelessness investments that are occurring from the state and that are being delivered at the local level. We've laid a strong and solid foundation and created the conditions for locals in the housing space to plan, to zone, and to permit more housing, to reverse the course on a housing shortage that, as we all know, has been many years and I would say decades in the making. We're tackling the stubborn housing supply shortage by deploying also innovative programs from Home Key to the Housing Accelerator, and funding new affordable homes through programs like the Multifamily Housing Program, and also leveraging the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program that's administered by HCD. As I mentioned, we're focused on improving the state's housing finance system, working closely and in collaboration with the state treasurer and the state controller to ensure that our state tax credits and bonds are addressing the populations with greater need and in line and aligned to the governor's priorities. So we're continuing to improve housing policies and ensuring that in the implementation of housing investments that we are respecting fair housing laws and furthering fair housing laws. We're also focused on leveraging other infrastructure investments and creating greater access to state funding resources in public lands. We're very focused from an equity and inclusion perspective and looking closely at how our programs keep certain people out and how our programs can create greater opportunity and greater access. As mentioned before, we're also very focused on holding local jurisdictions accountable for producing their fair share of housing for people across all income groups. You all know this number well, but I will say it again. The state has a housing plan that calls for local governments to plan for 2.5 million new units, with 1 million of these units being affordable by 2030. So again, very focused on expanding housing options and expanding housing opportunities. So just in summary, the budget that the governor has proposed reaffirms the administration's commitment to preserve affordable housing, to expand the housing supply of new units in urban, rural, and tribal communities. The budget also provides investments to provide long-term permanent housing options along with flexible aid. The budget also very much focuses on ensuring that there is continued alignment between housing and homelessness efforts. I will note that due to declining general fund revenues, the budget proposes a minor reduction of $350 million to 3 homeownership programs or homeownership related programs that were included in the 2022 Budget Act. My colleagues who have joined today's call will be able to provide some additional details. But even with these reductions, the state is still not the state is still very much putting forward unprecedented resources to support home ownership and to expand housing options. And finally, just as I wrap up here, there are a few other key areas that are very relevant to the work that we do in the housing space. One, I mentioned earlier, the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. This is the council that was created in charge with advancing a coordinated response and a coordinated system to addressing the homelessness crisis. I'm working closely with Secretary Galley as co-chairs and a number of state leaders and also a number of local leaders, including people with lived experience, to bring together a better understanding of the investments that the state is making at the state level, but also to ensure that there's greater accountability in terms of how we coordinate and deliver public safety programs, behavioral health services, education, and how we're continuing to braid these funds together to support Californians. Additionally, the Civil Rights Department, which is a department that is part of our agency, is continuing to educate landlords and tenants about their rights and enforcing source of income protections to prevent discrimination against low-income households and specifically Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program holders. So we look forward to continuing to work with all of you to ensure that no one has to experience housing discrimination. With additional resources in the budget for the Civil Rights Department, the department will bolster its efforts to remove unlawful and discriminatory statements from housing advertisements. They will continue to conduct fair housing testing and investigate and resolve source of income complaints to guard Californians, to guard their housing rights and their civil rights. So as I conclude, I just want to again sort of acknowledge that you all play a key role in the work that we're doing to address the housing affordability and housing challenges and really housing supply challenges. We've come a long way in the last 4 years, but we know that we can't reverse course. We can't make up for 20, 30, 40 years of not investing the way that maybe we should have been investing, not just at the state level, but also at the federal level. But we have come a long way to address the state's housing challenges, and we are steadfast and focused on continuing to deliver more and to continue the progress. We must be mindful that the state can't do this alone. We cannot solve these challenges by ourselves. So to solve these challenges, it also requires the federal level and the regional level and the local level, and activating residents at the local level to be part of the solution to scale our collective efforts here. The administration continues to collaborate with partners to invest in people and to bring together these investments to address California's most pressing needs. Together, I know that we can achieve our housing and homelessness goals. We can provide a more just and fair and accessible California. And, you know, housing is fundamental. I have said it many times, right? Housing is foundational to who we are and to who we can be. So thank you again for the work that you all do. And so with that, I'd like to now introduce and hand this over to my Deputy Secretary for Housing, Sasha Kurgan.
Thank you, Secretary. And hello, everyone. I'm going to start by just mentioning 3 objectives that are in our statewide housing plan. That is to keep Californians housed, to produce more affordable and climate smart housing, and to continue to act with urgency to address homelessness and housing need. Programs like HomeKey demonstrate these objectives in action and that these objectives are achievable. These objectives and these programs also show our resolve to deliver innovative strategies and partnerships and really focus on solutions that create housing and address homelessness. Over 2 rounds of HomeKey, the program has funded more than 12,700 permanent and interim housing opportunities for people exiting homelessness. And we aren't done yet. This spring, HCD will launch the 3rd round of HomeKey with another $750 million to a program that achieves results in every part of the state. Now, meanwhile, we keep taking steps to address the climate and housing crises together. As the Secretary mentioned, with programs like the new Catalytic Infill Infrastructure Grant Program or the Adaptive Reuse Grant Program, and traditional programs like the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. But there are others that really center housing as part of our climate strategy. So this budget reaffirms the administration's commitment to expanding the production and preservation of affordable housing with $1 billion for housing programs and an additional $500 million in state housing tax credits to accelerate housing production. But funding is not our only strategy to unwind the decades of housing underproduction that the Secretary mentioned. Our policy principle that's in the budget summary about accountability is really anchored in new land use laws, including permit streamlining, and additional authority to enforce those laws to actively remove barriers to housing development. Now, cities and counties are key partners here. They must plan and zone for housing and then permit it to be built to support housing opportunities in their communities. And if they add hurdles to building housing, they not only limit opportunities for Californians to be housed, but cities and counties could run the risk of violating state housing laws. So the state team will continue offering technical assistance to support local jurisdictions in complying with applicable housing laws. And when needed, we can add our accountability and enforcement efforts to make sure that state laws are upheld. These laws help our state make progress towards housing goals, and they add predictability to development, all of which helps decrease costs for housing development. The administration remains very interested in practical innovations in land use and construction and finance that can bend the cost curve for housing production. This includes administrative or statutory barriers that delay housing productions and increase costs. And we are very focused and prioritize removing barriers for extremely low-income housing and permanent supportive housing. As the Secretary mentioned, there will be some reductions proposed, and the Department of Finance is on in case there are technical questions. But I'd just say, in short, with fluctuating interest rates and homeownership inventory very low, the state is approaching homeownership programs with some additional care to both create opportunities for first-time homebuyers while not putting them into an unsustainable situation. So as a result, the budget will reduce dollars to CalHome, the Dream for All program, and the accessory dwelling unit program. But that said, the Dream for All program will still be launched this year to support low-income first-time homebuyers in a shared appreciation approach. And CalHFA is very excited and very skilled in being able to lead the implementation of this program. So as you've heard from us today, we will continue deploying many strategies to meet the housing needs of Californians. But now I'd like to hand it over to the Deputy Secretary for Homelessness, Dakshika Wickrama, to provide additional detail on the homelessness investments in the governor's budget.
Thank you, Sasha. As you all just heard, the governor is continuing to invest in the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention, also known as HAP program. And this program provides flexible funds to large cities, counties, continuums of care, and federally recognized California tribes. $3 billion in flexible one-time multi-year funding has been made available to all 58 counties, all 44 continuum of care entities, and the big cities through consecutive rounds of HAP funding to support local communities' efforts to build capacity, to strengthen systems, and address homelessness through these efforts. As committed previously, this budget will be investing $1 billion for a fifth round of HAP grants. And I saw a question had come up on that. In tandem with these flexible HAP funds, and again, as committed previously, the administration is also continuing to provide targeted funds to help people living in unsheltered situations. So there will be an additional $400 million for a third round of encampment resolution grants. This follows $50 million in a first round of encampment resolution grants and $300 million in a second round of encampment resolution grants. And that second round is actually open right now for applications. And the previous rounds have already allocated funds to 26 communities across the state to help them really work with people who are in unsheltered settings and get them connected to stable housing. As the Secretary mentioned, through the leadership of herself and Mark Galley, BCSH and CalHHS being co-chairs of the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, they both continue to spearhead a very intentional focus through that entity on cross-sector collaboration, both at the local level and at the state level, because we really want to ensure that housing, homelessness, health, and human services systems are working together to integrate forces and really serve Californians in a very person-centered way. This has been manifested not only through the statewide action plan to prevent any homelessness, which puts forward joint activities for state departments to work together across 5 pillars: that's strengthening systems, unsheltered homelessness, interim housing, permanent housing, and prevention. But most recently, as the Secretary mentioned, the storm system we are living through, both BCSH and CalHHS have been working together with multiple agencies and departments to ensure that people experiencing homelessness and unsheltered homeless folks in particular are being prioritized for assistance during the severe weather this week. Cross-sector collaboration is also a requirement of the HAP local homelessness action plans, which applicants submit to the state. And through these plans, they outline system performance metrics and goals that will be achieved over the multi-year funding period. So these plans are really tools that the state can use to help overlapping jurisdictions create stronger regional coordination, align goals, and develop joint opportunities for impact and accountability. And speaking of accountability, the administration will work with the legislature this year to advance accountability legislation to further strengthen these outcomes and systems. This may include identifying opportunities to focus funding on the highest priority needs, especially unsheltered homelessness, as well as pursuing statutory changes to condition eligibility for future funding on jurisdictions' ability to meet their housing obligations under state law. And you heard Sasha speak in more detail about some of that. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague at the Health and Human Services Agency, Deputy Secretary for Policy and Strategic Planning, Corinne Buchanan, who will provide more details on investments to fund clinically enhanced housing and services for people, as well as some new resources through CalAIM, California's Medicaid waiver.
Thank you so much, Dakshika. Hi, folks. Corinne Buchanan, Deputy Secretary for Policy and Strategic Planning with the California Health and Human Services Agency. So building on previous years, the focus of this year's budget investments at California Health and Human Services Agency around homelessness are on people with complex behavioral health conditions and an effort to leverage Medicaid to support our housing efforts, specifically on rental payments. And this is really about making good on our commitment to the connection between housing and health. So first off, though not a homelessness funding stream, the first item I'd like to lift up is the CARE Act, which creates a new pathway to deliver mental health and substance use disorder services to the most severely impaired Californians who too often suffer in homelessness and unfortunately in incarceration without treatment. The CARE Act moves care and support upstream by providing the most vulnerable Californians with access to critical behavioral health services. And because many of the individuals who may be served by the CARE Act are experiencing homelessness, ensuring that housing is a part of the care plan is baked into the model. 7 counties will begin serving individuals by October of 2023, with the remaining counties launching by December of 2024. Funding for the support of startup costs for counties and courts was included in the 2022 Budget Act, and this year's budget includes funding for county costs, for the courts, and for legal representation. Next up is the Behavioral Health Bridge Housing Program, which provides $1.5 billion in funding to counties to address the immediate housing needs of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness who have serious behavioral health conditions by providing clinically enhanced bridge or interim housing settings. So this budget released today by the governor delays $250 million in general fund of that total $1.5 billion to 2024. But the budget maintains the full $1 billion in general fund in 22-23, and it maintains $250 million in general fund in 23-24 for this program. So next, I'll highlight 2 opportunities to support rental payments, which we all know here is very key to our work. And we're doing this through a Medicaid and through waiver programs in particular. These 2 that I'm about to describe will require federal approval, but we continue to push the envelope on leveraging federal funds in our efforts to address homelessness here in California. So the first opportunity is the CalAIM Transitional Rent Waiver Amendment. So for this one, in order to improve the well-being and health outcomes of our Medi-Cal members during critical transitions, our Department of Healthcare Services will seek an amendment to the CalAIM waiver to authorize an additional community support for use by Medi-Cal managed care plans. The new community support would pay for 6 months of rent or temporary housing to eligible individuals experiencing or at risk of homelessness who are transitioning out of institutional levels of care or correctional facilities or the foster care system, and who are at risk of inpatient hospitalizations or emergency department visits. The budget includes $17.9 million in 25-26, increasing to $116.6 million at a full per year at full implementation of this program. The second opportunity is the California Behavioral Health Continuum, Community-Based Continuum Waiver, which is an 1115 demonstration waiver also being pursued by the Department of Healthcare Services. This waiver will expand behavioral health services for Medi-Cal beneficiaries living with serious mental illness and serious emotional disturbance, with a focus on children and youth, people experiencing homelessness, and justice-involved individuals. Among many other goals that I don't have time to get into today, the waiver would allow counties to cover rent or temporary housing also for up to 6 months for certain high needs beneficiaries, as well as supportive employment to help address critical needs for the treatment and recovery of individuals living with serious behavioral health conditions. And with that, I have the pleasure of turning it back to Victoria so that we can get into that question period of today.
Thank you so much, Corinne, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing more about the housing and homelessness elements in the governor's proposed budget plan. Now we are going to go ahead and open it up for questions. Please type in the Q&A box if you have a question you would like to be answered. As a reminder, we do have a hard stop at 4:45. So we will try to get to as many questions as we can by then, but if we do not answer your question, we will do our best to follow up and provide answers. So first, I'm going to go ahead and start. There is a question for our team and for Dakshika. The question is, what specific elements is the governor's office proposing to implement to ensure additional accountability? And there are questions about whether this is through legislation or additional by giving the Housing Accountability Unit more enforcement powers. So I'll turn it over to you and feel free to add other members of the team to support your answer.
Thank you, Victoria. And I see Miles has joined as well. And I think there's a reference to this in the A pages as well. Victoria, if people are able to go there. But part of what will be going on is throughout this year, there will be close communication and coordination between the governor's office and our team and the legislature to really think through what this looks like. And as the secretary mentioned, some of this is predicated on the fact that homelessness and outcomes for people experiencing homelessness are really fundamentally a result of lack of housing. So we are really trying to tie systemically how people can really boost their housing production in line with housing law that exists already. But I'll let Miles also add some more details. But the bottom line answer is there will be more to come as we roll through communication, coordination, and negotiations between the legislature and the administration on this point.
Well, thanks, Dakshika. And really, I saw a couple of similar notes, questions in the chat. And this is, to the extent we can provide specifics at this point, what we're really envisioning is building off of a lot of the efforts that the Cal-ACH team undertook this past fall, as well as are currently undertaking on our evaluations of HAP4, but really expanding beyond what the focus has been in terms of specific outcome goals, but looking really at the tangible actions that are underlying a lot of those efforts that we're hoping to continue to see progress for our grantees throughout the state. So this is, of course, contingent on our discussions with our counterparts in the legislature. And I think really at the heart of it is making sure that these investments are continued to be tied to tangible results and actions that are really consistent with best practices that we are seeing in large parts of the state, but also at times inconsistent. And we want to make sure that we are providing as much technical assistance and at the same time specific accountability as needed.
Thank you so much. So our next question is oriented to Corinne. We have a couple of questions for you. One about if you could explain more about the details of the 6-month rent subsidy program, and then another question related to what homeless programs administered by CDSS have allocations towards counties.
Sure, thanks, Victoria. So we'll have more information. Again, these are both of the transitional rental assistance through the Medicaid or our STEAM program and our additional waiver, behavioral health, community-based continuum waiver, are waivers that will go through an approval process with CMS. And so we'll be able to share more details on those programs as they become available. And then in terms of the questions around Department of Social Services programs, no additional new funding beyond the baseline funding for those programs in this particular budget cycle.
Thank you, Corinne. Next, we have a question for Sasha. Just wanting to ask more specifics on how the housing departments will be working with regional entities and plans to make state funding more accessible and streamlined.
Great, and I'd invite Director Velasquez to add anything too, in case he's interested. But the Department of Housing and Community Development works with regional entities in a lot of ways, most notably in working to prepare and respond to RHNA requirements of the Regional Housing Need Allocation, which all is part of our housing element process in our state. And so deep collaboration and consultation with regional entities is really the kickoff point for that exercise. And the work is ongoing because not everyone's on the same cycle. Right now, while not part of the budget presentation today, but there's also been the Regional Early Action Planning Grants that specifically serves regional entities. So those are just a couple of varieties of things that we do. Lots of overlap in housing and transportation, particularly when we're thinking about how we advance our goals in housing and transportation. Coordination with regional entities really lines up there. Victoria, I'm sorry, I already lost the second part of the question. Oh, about aligning funding. Yeah, so this last fiscal year, we've been able to see the effects of a really big effort at HCD to align multiple housing programs into one solicitation, which is known as the Super Notice of Funding Availability. And so that clarified requirements to make requirements more congruent, and also made sure that folks were clear on timing and being able to come in one solicitation to achieve multiple policy goals. That effort for the multifamily Super NOFA was complemented by what was just released on Friday for the homeownership Super NOFA. So again, aligning two programs into one. Gustavo, I see you. Maybe you want to add some other thoughts.
Well, the additional thought I have is the alignment is comprehensive within programs in the State Housing Department. It is more than that. It's really aligning our state goals across the full spectrum of the affordable housing financing system that encompass other programs in the administration, and of course, the criteria through which the state provides tax-exempt bonds and tax credits. So it's been an effort to really align the full spectrum of priorities that the governor has, and that the administration is focused on achieving now and in the years ahead.
Thank you so much. The next question, I believe, is for Corinne. So it says that recently the state of California was seeking to provide very in need individuals the necessary mental health and substance abuse treatment via specialized support. And the question is there a plan to prioritize the number of unhoused people receiving substance abuse and rehabilitation services that is on part of housing?
I'll share a little bit. I can put in the chat some information about our California Behavioral Health Community-Based Continuum Waiver, which is designed to support increased community-based behavioral health treatment programs across the state. So happy to share a little bit more about the ways in which it's a part of a larger package of reform efforts around our behavioral health system, in addition to parity reform, the work happening under simplifying our behavioral health system through CalAIM, as well as some of the investments being made in behavioral health workforce, housing for people with behavioral health conditions, our infrastructure program to create new behavioral health treatment facilities across the state, among other. So happy to point you in the direction of some of those resources in the chat.
Thank you. And there is a follow-up question about the amount proposed for Care Court.
Sure. So as listed in the 8 pages, the funding level for the administration of the CARE Act for county admin costs is $108 million. Ultimately, it's a ramp-up period that ultimately goes up to $108 million.
Great, thank you. So there is a question here about whether or not keeping people housed includes smaller mom and pop housing providers with rent and mortgage relief, if their local municipality has extended the eviction moratorium to fill the gaps in resources that would continue to be lost. So, Sasha, do you mind clarifying that question?
Yeah, and I see Miles as well too. So let me just back up a little bit and just share it with folks a little bit about our state rental assistance program. We have already deployed more than $4 billion and served 350,000 households statewide with critical rental assistance resources right in the middle of the pandemic. We have continued to work on that effort, and now we'll continue exploring ways to support localities as they think about rental assistance in their communities. You know, some localities are using PLHA dollars for rental assistance and other sources to really provide critical needs in their communities. So I can't speak to individual moratoria, but can just kind of anchor our answer in what the state has done already. And Miles, anything else that you want to add on rental assistance?
Yeah, I think to Sasha's point, really, as we emerged from the emergency response during the pandemic, a lot of the long-term capital subsidies that have been provided in recent years, but also are contemplated and proposed in this budget, is really the focus of what we're trying to pursue in terms of long-term investments, and really that level of subsidized rental assistance in a different form, as opposed to what version that we had to deploy given the emergency response during the pandemic. So very much in a place of winding down those efforts, although there are still significant resources available on the mortgage assistance side from our colleagues at the California Housing Finance Agency who are on the line. I'm happy to provide additional information as needed.
I can take that. My name is Frances Marti. I'm the Director of Policy, Strategy, and Legislation at the California Housing Finance Agency. And as Miles alluded to, CalHFA has been deploying a California Mortgage Relief Program for borrowers that are behind on their mortgage payments. And this program is available to owner-occupied 1 to 4 family housing. And yes.
Thanks, Francesca.
Thank you all. So we also had a couple questions just asking. One is one of the efforts that is budgeted to help local cities with administering their Section 8 programs to make it easier for tenants and housing providers to use the program. We also got questions about the anti-discrimination work at the Civil Rights Department. So wanted to give Director Kish an opportunity to answer that question.
Thanks. The questions related to the source of income protections, right, Victoria? Yeah. So state law changed 2 years ago to include low-income housing choice voucher holders within the protections of state anti-discrimination law in our fair housing laws, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, meaning landlords may not discriminate against people who hold vouchers. The law doesn't require landlords to rent to any particular individual with a voucher, but landlords may not discriminate against them or treat them differently than others. The Civil Rights Department enforces this law, and the governor's budget does include resources for us to continue and expand upon our efforts to enforce it, which include our traditional mechanisms of processing complaints that we receive from tenants and applicants who believe they were turned away because they hold housing choice vouchers or other types of lawful source of income through voucher programs. Filing lawsuits where appropriate, where we find violations of the law, but also conducting searches of discriminatory language on online ads and sending compliance letters to remove that language, and conducting fair housing testing. And for those of you who want to visit our website, we have issued a press release about our findings from an initial round of fair housing testing, which finds widespread discrimination, unsurprisingly, from many of the stakeholders on this call against voucher holders in California, including at rates of more than 50% of the tests returning evidence of discrimination.
Thank you so much, Director Kish. So we are at time, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us to learn more about the housing and homelessness investments in the governor's proposed budget. To go ahead and close this out, I'm going to hand it over to Secretary Castro Ramirez. And if you have additional questions and those that we weren't able to get to today, please email housing@bcsh.ca.gov, and we will go ahead and follow up with you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I do want to take just a quick moment to acknowledge the various directors that have joined us today. Gustavo Velasquez over HCD, Kevin Kish, who leads our Civil Rights Department, Tina Johnson Hall, who leads the California Housing Finance Agency, and Doug McCauley, Commissioner of the Department of Real Estate. We thank you all so much for the work that you're doing in your communities. Thank you for joining this budget briefing on the governor's commitment to continuing to further housing options, housing that's affordable, and also continuing our commitment to work across state government, work in partnership with local government, and leverage our relationship with the federal government to ensure that extremely low-income individuals and families have the opportunity to have a supported place to call home. Thank you all so much. Please stay safe. For information on the state's response on this extreme severe storm condition, please, I would encourage you to go to caloes.ca.org. Please stay safe. Muchas gracias.